When I was around 13, my family and I moved into an old house. It was at least 90 years old and remained in pristine condition for all of these years. The house itself was nice, but the inside gave you that unsettling feeling due to its antique design. It was bothersome, but I sucked it up and decided to give the new home a chance. Everything about the neighborhood seemed okay. The people were nice and didn't have much commotion, which is what my parents were looking for. During the first week, one of our neighbors had brought over some cookies as a welcome to the neighborhood. She was this old, petite Cuban woman who had the personality of a teddy bear. In other words, she was nice and was willing to help any way she could. Her name was Maria and claimed to have moved here just a few months prior to our arrival. She had told us about the history of the neighborhood, some of the rules, and seemed she knew a lot about it. One day, she had come over to the house to tell my parents more about the neighborhood. For some reason, they felt sort of uncomfortable around her. Like she was nice, but she was one of those people who overstayed their welcome. My parents weren't the type to assume, but something was just off about her. Fast forward about a month later, my parents had gone out for a work company event. I was home alone with one of my friends from school playing video games when we hear a noise from outside. Now, in order to understand this next part, you need to understand the layout of my house. My room is on the second floor, so when you look out my window, you could see into the backyard of the next house. The noise was similar to someone spray painting a wall or something. We look outside to see that my theory was semi-correct. The woman who was my neighbor is using a water hose spraying something on the concrete. It was around 6 p.m. and was somewhat dark out, but I was still able to see that whatever she was spraying appeared to be a red liquid. We watch for a good while as she begins to clean and sanitize the concrete when she looks up at my window. We immediately duck down, shitting our pants and hoping she didn't see us. Thankfully, she didn't come to the door or confront us in any way. However, we were still suspicious about her intentions and told my parents about it. At first, they thought I was telling them one of my stories, as I was known to lie here and there. But when they found out I wasn't lying, they called the police just to be sure. After about a week of law enforcement investigating her, we then learned a harsh truth. As it turns out, the red liquid we had seen was blood. She had murdered her husband for reasons I won't go into, but to put it simply, she couldn't take him anymore. Police had also found several drawn pictures of her husband on her walls to use as some sort of trophy. She, of course, was arrested and put in jail for I assumed what was the rest of her life. We had only known her for a little over a month, and we were shocked to learn what had happened. What had once been this friendly neighbor only turned out to be a monster behind closed doors. This story is told in the perspective of a female. A few years ago, I used to live in a relatively suburban neighborhood right outside of Houston. It wasn't a bad neighborhood, but it was one where you'd be in some hot water if you piss off the wrong person. Let's just say the people weren't my favorite. At the time, I had just gotten over a very long and very toxic relationship with my abusive boyfriend over things I won't go into. At the time of the breakup, I had my daughter, who was 7 at the time, and she came to live with me as I didn't want her in a dangerous environment. As a matter of fact, it got so bad that we had to move to a new state. One day, I was outside my front porch painting canvases with my daughter when I see someone approach us holding something wrapped in a plate. As they got closer, I began to realize that it was a boy, probably around 17 or 18, bringing a plate of brownies. He walks right to us and introduced himself as Louis, welcoming us to the neighborhood. I tell him thank you and that it was very sweet of him. I tell my daughter to continue painting while I spoke to Lewis about the area and seeing if he knew things that I didn't. It turns out that Lewis was actually 19 who still lived with his parents and attended school not too far away from the neighborhood. We speak for about a good 20 minutes before finally telling him it was nice to meet him and to have a good day. After my conversation with Lewis, I started to think that maybe I was too soon to judge people who lived around here. But as time progressed, I began to see the real Lewis. Every day, he would come by our house to check up on us and would even ask to say hi to my daughter at certain times. The more time went by, the weirder his visits got. One morning, I was rolling out our garbage bins to the street as the truck would be coming that afternoon when I see Lewis walking around smoking. He sees me and starts walking over to me, to which I then quietly cuss to myself in annoyance. Trying not to be rude, I say hi and he straight up asks me how I served time when I was deployed to Iraq. I'd like to note that I was ex-military, but never disclosed this information to him as I kept it very personal to me and my family. In fact, I don't even think I told my ex about it. I give him a dirty look and briefly tell him about it and said that I did my country a great service. Not wanting to talk to him anymore, I walk back inside mad and a bit creeped out, wondering as to how he knew about that. I didn't bother going to confront him about it as I felt that would make things worse. The next day, Lewis calls me wanting to speak with my daughter. I furiously cuss to him and tell him I don't want to hear from him again and to stay the hell away from my daughter. Right then and there, I decided that it was time to break the monotony of his constant harassment. I go over to his house, knock on his door, and was greeted to what I assumed were both of Lewis's parents. Without hesitation, I really let them have it, explaining the whole ordeal and told them that I better not see him again. But instead of showing remorse or sympathy, they almost acted like they didn't care and only gave a weak apology. Not wanting to feed the fire, I go back home and go to bed trying to get rid of all the stress that was on me. I'd say I slept for a good 3 hours before being abruptly woken up by the loud sirens of a police car. I look out my window and, to my shock, I see 3 police officers handcuffing Lewis while placing him inside of the cruiser. The reason as to why he was being arrested will forever stick with me in the back of my head. When I went to see what was happening, the police had some very disturbing news for me. Someone had apparently ratted him out. Lewis had several pictures of me and my daughter printed all over his wall taken from the inside of my house. One of them was a picture of my daughter sleeping in her own bed. I'm a female who currently lives in the downtown area of a genuinely safe city. Because of the global pandemic, I've gotten laid off at my job and have been inside since working on my online business. While the area was safe, the apartments around here were very small and crammed, almost like the size of a prison cell. It's only large enough to fit a bed, a TV, and maybe a desk if you were lucky. Due to the lack of space in my apartment, I have to go outside and exercise for my mental health. One night, I had just finished dinner and put on my shoes to go for a midnight jog to burn off the extra calories. I go outside and start jogging when, out of nowhere, a man I had never seen before stops me dead in my tracks. He was a younger looking guy, maybe about late 20s and wearing a hoodie and some shorts. Right away, he introduced himself as Bill and that he had just moved into my building a few doors down. I told him that it was nice to meet him and hoped he enjoyed his move-in. However, He didn't seem to acknowledge or care about my welcoming and just stood there asking what I was doing. Trying to be nice, I briefly told him that I was jogging around the block. He then asks me if he could join me, to which I then politely decline and tell him I do better without a partner. Before allowing him to say anything else, I tell him I have to go and that I'll see him later. Now, I'm normally nice and enjoy talking to people, but something about him seemed off. Long story short, I finish my jog and go back inside of my building with thankfully no sign of Bill. I head to my room and go inside, and right when I was about to close the door, someone's arm blocks it. Startled, I open the door to see Bill standing there with an unsettling grin across his face. I awkwardly laugh and try to be polite as I could, asking him if he needed anything. He then asks me if he could come in so that we could get to, quote, know each other a little more. As weird as it was, I hesitantly told him yes, but only for a bit as I had work in the morning. He walked inside and I told him to have a seat and if there was anything I could get him. He disregards what I said and immediately asks me if I had a boyfriend, to which I then told him yes. Right as I said this, his so-called smile then turned into a frown of disappointment. Feeling a bit creeped out, I tell him I have to go to bed and that I'll see him tomorrow. He then gets up violently and pushes in the kitchen chair and slams the door, giving me the finger. I, of course, lock it and tell my boyfriend everything that happened via FaceTime. About 2 weeks later, I'm laying in my bed about to fall asleep when I hear a heavy knock at the door. I open it and was greeted to the woman who works at the front desk, and she then asks if I know Bill. I told her yes and explained my little encounter with him. What she told me next will forever stay in the back of my mind. Apparently, he had been living in my building for well over a year now after his girlfriend had left him. He has a major addiction to heroin and had been arrested multiple times for rape and battery against multiple women. He was thankfully arrested again, and I became instantly shocked by the news. Till this day, I still wonder if I would have been his next victim had I allowed him to jog with me that one night.